Hello and welcome to the garden. Well, the woolly hat is back, and that's because the weather has turned a bit miserable once again. So we've had a few days of glorious weather, almost summer-like, and now it's colder, wet, windy and miserable. And there's a miserable gardener here too, because I've gone and messed up badly. And I'm not a happy chappy today, although I'm going to do my best to make excuses and pretend it's got nothing to do with me, of course. So once again, I'm talking about tomato grafting, and it's something I've been having fun with the last couple of years. So I did this for the first time 2 years ago, reasonably successful the first time, great the second time, and this year, yeah, it's not going to happen. So, rootstocks, what is the problem? Well, I've got a fair few that haven't germinated, and then I've got a lot of them that look like that. That's a bit rubbish, but they're all over the place. I mean, here's a little collection. Look at the difference in size and stem diameters. I mean, these are dreadful. I suppose they will eventually get going, but I don't know what's wrong with them this year. So the odd thing is that the first year when I tried the grafting, because there's a timing thing to get a grip on. I know I've talked about this a lot. In order to graft, you've got to get the stems of the variety you're trying to graft on and the rootstock somewhere on those stems. They got to match in diameter, and accuracy of that is pretty important, because the critical tissues that have to join up, they're just under the surface of the stem there, and if they don't line up, those vascular tissues, they're not going to fuse, and that's a disaster. I mean, it's the same as with a tree. The critical tissues are just under the bark there in the cambium layer, and that's the tissues that you need to get to fuse. So that diameter is ever so critical. It's probably the single most critical factor, and the second one is to do with watering, so that when you're grafting, you haven't just watered the rootstocks and there's not a pressure of the sap there that will force that graft apart. And then you've got to heal them in the right sort of warm, humid conditions. But the most important factor, getting them to the right size. And as a newcomer to this area, that's the bit that's always worrying me. So the first year, I've had seeds from two different places now. I've had 2 years, the last 2 years, from one supplier. The first year I got them somewhere else, and they didn't have them last year, and I don't think they had them this year either, so I was forced to go elsewhere. Now, that first batch of rootstocks, they germinated. Some of those were up within 3 days, incredibly fast. I was shocked by how quickly they germinated. I mean, I'm used to waiting a week or so before I see the first tomato seedling popping up, and maybe I'll have to wait a fortnight for all of them to come through. But these started to appear at the end of the 3rd day, and within 5 days, I think they were almost all of them were up. Germination was incredibly good, so I can't remember how many I started, but it might be on one of the old videos, but let's say I started 80, then 1 or 2 of them may not have come up. So really great germination. The other thing was that growth was incredibly uniform. Now, these are hybrid seeds, so you expect that uniformity. That there's very little variation in the genetics there. The plants they'll all have the same vigor, all other things being equal. So they were all very uniform, and they raced away. And the problem the first season was that my varieties were behind, because they're old open pollinated varieties. They're a bit sluggish to get going. They don't grow as fast as the hybrid rootstocks, and that's what was tricky the first season. Now I had enough to graft, and I had enough that I could fill the greenhouses with grafted tomatoes. I didn't have enough to fill the polytunnel, but that was fine. Now the second year I made an allowance for that, and I started 2 batches of varieties so that I could have one started a lot earlier. Last year the rootstocks weren't as good. There's no doubt about it. Germination wasn't quite as good. Uniformity wasn't as good, and the growth rate wasn't as good. Now, on paper, this is the identical variety. So what on earth is causing that difference? I really don't know. It's a bit of a mystery, but it was quite a stark contrast between those 2 sowings. As far as I can tell, everything here has been identical. Pretty much the same sowing medium, the same sort of temperature, the same size pot. Nothing here has been, I wouldn't think, markedly different. Not enough to explain what's going on with these rootstocks. But that was last year, and so the first sowing of the varieties, that was a write-off. I couldn't use those; they were far too big. The second sowing was fine, and in the end I had tons of grafted plants, and I filled both greenhouses and the polytunnel with grafted plants. Worked very well. So this year I didn't do that really early sowing. I was just 4 days, 4 or 5, I can't remember, it's on one of the recent videos, between those sowings, and I thought that would be fine. Except this time round, these rootstocks were even worse than last season. Now, at this point, I'd only had 2 years to judge from, and 1 year they were spectacularly uniform and fast and quick growing, and the second year they were a little bit ragged. Well, this time round they're absolutely dreadful, and I can't figure out what on earth is going on. I mean, it's just that is not good. This thing here is utterly useless. This one, it's a nice rootstock, but it's the wrong size. So while these rootstocks have been wasting their time sat here doing nothing, and I mean this one is one of the few decent sized rootstocks. Most of them are smaller, this sort of size, and looking a little bit rubbish. So while they've been wasting time here, the varieties have been rushing away, and I've got these in large cells, in cell trays, but the reason I put them in cell trays is because I don't want to grow them on. I'm going to decapitate them when I do the grafting and throw their roots away. So put them in reasonable sized cells is fine. However, I can't graft them because they're far too big now, and I've been trying to sort of retard them a little bit. So conditions in here have been better for growing on the rootstocks. They've been a little bit warmer, they got better light. I've cooled the others down. I've even put some shade netting on them. That of course causes them to stretch out a little bit, but I don't want fat stems for the grafting. It's the last thing I need because the rootstocks are so skinny. I've done what I can to try and get these to hold them back. That will turn out to have been a second mistake. So the first mistake is, I don't know, getting the timing wrong or the wrong supplier of seed, because there's something not right with these rootstocks. But of course now I've got rather long, unhappy tomato varieties. So let me show you the varieties and you'll instantly see why grafting is not going to happen this time. Yes, there is a jungle, and the width of these stems, many of these are pretty chunky. There are one or two where maybe I could cut from high up on here. It would have to be above the first set of true leaves probably, but maybe I could take a cut really high on one of those and try to graft it onto one of the largest of the available rootstocks. But there are not many where that is going to be possible, and I'm not going to bother because it's quite a faff. I mean, the grafting itself, if you're doing a big batch of it, it's no problem. You take a few hours to do the job, and then you've got a big batch of them sat in the healing chamber, a box. I use one of the propagators with shade netting over the top, but you put them in there, keep it humid, shaded and warm, and you've got a big batch of them that you're looking after. But if you're doing it for just a couple of plants, I have to move the propagator indoors, faff around. I can't be bothered with it for just 2 or 3 that I might be able to find matching diameters. And I'm also not convinced by these rootstocks at all. I don't know why they're so weak growing. They were a little bit suspicious last season. It's sort of a similar thing has happened, only it's more extreme this time. I think there are more that didn't germinate, and there's a much bigger range of sizes here, and this is so different from the first batch that I did 2 years ago that I don't really understand it. I mean, I'm inclined to think there's some difference between the seeds I got from one supplier and the original supplier and those I got from this one. I'm not going to name the suppliers because I won't. I'm quite happy to call out dodgy suppliers. I've done it before, but only when I'm certain that it is a dodgy supplier and not potentially something that I've done wrong. And it's always very difficult to tell when you're sowing something whether poor results are down to something you've done wrong with watering or temperature or whatever, or whether it's dodgy seed. Now sometimes it's dodgy seed. So germination, for example, on the varieties, that has been overall pretty good, fairly even and good germination. Certainly quite even within varieties. There's some variation between the varieties, of course. Some are more vigorous than others. There were 2 varieties that did not germinate well. I think I've got one example of one of them and maybe 2 of another, and that was a bit annoying, but I'm sure that was seed rather than anything I did, because the rest of the tray was perfectly all right. So I think under those circumstances you can be fairly confident that's just a problem with that particular packet of seed. I don't know about these rootstocks. I am not happy, and I should do my very best not to buy them again from that supplier. I don't know where I'm going to get them, but I think this year I've got to scrap it. But that means I've got to turn these leggy old varieties into normal plants. And well, let's take the most vigorous looking specimen and just see what the root ball is like. Let me pop it out gently. Well, as you can see, there's a nice network of fine roots here, and these cell trays are lovely. They do produce really nice plants, good roots there. It's not pot bound, so it hasn't gone too far. It's at the point where it does want to be moved on though, and if I move them on now, they're going to respond very well indeed. The thing is, of course, where I've been trying to hold these back, they are quite tall, and I will be sinking them at least down to the seed leaves there. So I'm going to want deep pots to move these on. And there's a lot of them, but this is my job for today. I will not be filming the potting on of 80 tomato plants. That would not be much fun. In fact, I'm not even going to pot that many on, because I will pot on what I need plus a few spares, because we've got a lot more of these than I need, simply because I had extra so that I could find the best matches to the rootstocks. Yeah, that ain't working. Anyway, that's basically it for this video. I will pot one on and we'll see how that goes, but yeah, a bit disappointing. So I don't think I will be getting any grafted plants this year, and that's a pity, because they won't perform as well in our greenhouses. Sure, we'll have plenty of tomatoes. I'm sure of that, because we've got plenty of space, lots of plants. How many will I put in? Probably 48 plants, something like that, or was it just 40? Whatever it is, it's a lot of tomato plants. So I'm not going to be short of tomatoes, but I will of course have a reduced yield and reduced size on those fruits. But more importantly, I'll have much less healthy plants, because we've been growing tomatoes in that same soil in the greenhouses for a long time, and I'm sure it's impacted over those years. The productivity and the health of the plants has declined a little bit. So it is a shame. I will return to the grafting next year, but hopefully I'll find a different supplier of the rootstocks, or I'll try a different rootstock. I was hoping after a few years to build up the experience of exactly when to sow and so on, but I might have to get a larger batch of rootstocks and sow a dozen of them or so ahead of time, just to see how they perform, get an idea what I've got to deal with, and if they perform like these, I will sow them a lot earlier. If they perform like the first batch, I will sow them later. Anyway, time to do some potting on. Now, I've got some bigger pots for these. Unfortunately, I don't have square pots. I much prefer square pots. I think they're better for the roots. In the round pot, they tend to spiral round. They don't do that to the same extent in a square pot. And also, of course, the square pot, for the same volume of soil, it stacks so much better in the propagators, and I do have to keep these nice and warm still. You can see that this is a pretty rough compost blend. There's all sorts of stuff in here, a little touch of feed, but there's some rougher compost stuff. You've got bits of wood and junk in it. It's not sieved at all, but for this purpose that really doesn't matter. I want a bit of compost in the bottom, and let me find a victim. So I want to set that down quite low, and all these will develop nice roots all the way along there. So I will set it a little bit lower when I then put it in the ground in the greenhouse or polytunnel, wherever this one is going. And that is that. Well, I have to repeat that 40, 50 times, I suppose. Well, that's my job today. But you can see, I think, that, I mean, even on this largest specimen, there's very little prospect of grafting these. To find the matching diameter, I'd have to cut right down the bottom here and maybe nip off the top, but it's not good. And you have to be careful, because when you get to places like this on the stem, that stem isn't round here. It's round here, and but above that point, this stem isn't round. So where these leaves are coming out, it's bigger this way than that, and so it's, you know, it's slightly flat. There'll be, it's slightly uneven surface. If you cut through here, you've got a nice round stem most of the way up to about here. So you don't want to be cutting above this point, because you're not going to get a round stem, and that then is going to match very poorly with this. Well, it's not going to match with that one at all. So I'll pot those up, and then I will try and squeeze them all into the propagators. Hopefully they fit, because we can still have some cool temperatures, and even if we don't get down to freezing temperatures in the greenhouses, and we probably won't now, even when we've had some light frosts recently, it's no problem in the greenhouses. I've got the potatoes coming through in pots in there, and they would certainly show it if there were any problems with frost. I haven't even bothered to fleece them this year, because it hasn't been cold enough for that. In the greenhouses near the wall, they're absolutely fine. But even though we wouldn't necessarily get tissue damage from the cold, we would get some very unhappy plants, and you want to try and keep the tomatoes above 10 degrees ideally. Maybe above 12 would be better. I think 10 is fine. If you keep them above 10, there's not going to be any problem. I think they might even go just a touch lower, but not for long periods. But you certainly don't want them going down to 4 or 5 degrees in the night. It's too cold for them. They'll get that bluish look, and then you might get a check in growth, and you don't want that. You want them to keep growing happily. And okay, well, they are a little bit tall now, but I mean, I did that deliberately because I had a layer of shade netting. I think that netting is 50% shade, so that of course has caused them to stretch out. That would have been a great idea had these rootstocks taken off and I'd been able to graft them eventually, because that was definitely helping, keeping them cooler, shading them slightly, retarding their growth as much as I can. If I'd kept these in the same place as the rootstocks, they would be even further ahead. So yeah, bit of a disaster this time. But anyway, I've got a bit of a job to crack on with, and I think that is the end of this waffle fest. So if you're still listening, thank you very much. But that is all for this one. Thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.